Either you let those things that are really difficult to learn to do defeat you, or you're motivated to want to learn them. And if you stay motivated, eventually you learn something. You have to learn the freedom to fail, to be a failure in order to learn how to do something. Because if you let failure defeat you and quit, then you never learn it. You have to give in to full acceptance and no resistance to being a kook.
That was Gerry Lopez. I'm Forrest here, and this is On Knowing Ongoing. Last year, I took off on some side quests to link up with a handful of friends to talk story. It was a chance to dive deep with some of the most influential individuals in my life. A central theme of all the conversations was the idea of mentorship and how it's shown up in their lives. Our first stop for the series was with Gerry Lopez in Bend, Oregon. From his early exploits at Pipeline to his current guru-like status in the industry, it's safe to say that few, if any, surfers have had as big of an influence on the world of surfing. But him and I first met in the mountains after he'd left the North Shore of Oahu and moved to Bend to build a life for his family and pursue his newfound passion for snowboarding. We joined Gerry for a few sessions at the local wave on the Deschutes River. I got schooled by the master, then rolled back to his shop together to dig through his quiver and watch him shape a board, and then sit down for a long conversation about his extraordinary life. He told us about his first waves in Waikiki, his own influential mentors, finding his way into the mountains, and how having a beginner's mind has propelled him through it all. Here's Gerry Lopez.
Yeah, Gerry, so tell us about growing up in Hawaii. Where'd you follow in the birth order? And did your siblings influence you as a kid? You got any stories about them?
Well, born in Hawaii, Kapilani Hospital. I had an older sister by 2 years and a younger brother by 2 years. And the three of us were the Three Musketeers. And, big sister kind of lorded over us. But when I was 10 and my younger brother Victor was 8, my mom was always a school teacher. She had a couple students that had a surfboard concession down at Waikiki Beach, and we had been pestering her and my dad we wanted to try surfing because we used to spend a lot of time down at the beach there at Waikiki. Back then in those days, the locals used to refer to Waikiki as simply the beach, as if there were no other. And for us, there really wasn't. It was beautiful down there, white sand, everything. But we went down. Her students, I don't know what she promised them, maybe, a break on homework or some better grades or something. But they let us pick out a surfboard each, and we paddled out. My mom swam out. This is like right out there at Baby Queens. And she shoved me into the first wave and Victor into the second one, and that was it. We were hooked for life. And yeah, so, the whole family, we have so many old pictures of Waikiki Beach because every, afternoon after school, every weekend, we were always down there. And that was kind of where we grew up, and that's, where we saw the guys surfing, and we wanted to do that too.
So everything changed after that.
Well, it was really a wonderful time. I was born in the late 40s, and the 1950s, this was before statehood. Statehood came to Hawaii in 1959, but those early days, it was like a small island It wasn't busy. It was really after statehood that the government got behind promoting tourism. And that's when things really started to grow. And, looking back, I remember those early days as being so idyllic. Not a lot of people on the beach, and every Sunday down there at Queen Surf, where we always were, they'd have the luau, and they'd cook the pig, and my brother and I would hang around when they pulled the pig out of the emu, and after they got it all set, then they'd let us come over and pick the crispy skin off the wire that they always wrapped around. And those were the good old days, man. The natatorium was just down the beach a little ways. That was a seawater swimming pool that they built after World War One, and then they put in the aquarium, which was right next to the natatorium, and that was a treasure. And then the Honolulu Zoo was right across the street too, and that was Kapiolani Park there. That was just really a beautiful public park, and it was just a great place to grow up.
Amazing. Yeah, a little bit. We talked a little bit before about kind of the heyday of the Royal Hawaiian and some of the ships coming in. Or any Beach Boys that you guys looked up to? Or I'm sure Duke was around then, yeah?
Well, yeah. I met Duke. Actually, I was, kind of still in high school, and he was old by then. But the stories of the Beach Boys and, how they ran that beach at Waikiki, it was kind of the end of their era when we started hanging out down there. But it was still such a wonderful place, the wall there where all the guys would body surf and ride the paddle boards, and, just standing up on the top of the wall watching that. And then sometimes when the surf was big, when outside Kunas was breaking, and then public baths was a great surf spot right in front of the beach where we always used to go, and just watching those guys surf there. So it was kind of natural that we would want to do that, and ended up doing that, and ended up spending a whole lifetime doing that. But it was a really easy thing to do. I was into other sports and stuff. I played Little League and Pop Warner football and basketball and all that stuff, but surfing was kind of the thing, because once I started high school, I realized I wasn't big enough to be a jock, and I wasn't good looking enough to be, a good looking guy in school, a popular guy, and I wasn't smart enough to be a brain. And I was kind of, what can I be? And all of a sudden the light bulb went on. I'll be a surfer. And, that was kind of an identity. And there wasn't really anything like it is today where, you could actually be a surfer and be somebody and, make a living at it. There was no such thing as that. But it was an identity that I could have and feel comfortable with. And, somebody would ask, the girls especially in school, what do you do? I surf. That was enough. They go, oh. Because back then, surfing was kind of low on the social status, Parents didn't want their kids to grow up to be surfers. The surfers that we looked up to, the good ones, were guys that, if they had a car, they lived in it. And if they didn't, they lived with a bunch of other guys, in a flop house that had cheap rent, and, it was not a real glamorous lifestyle. But it was something that I wanted to do.
Yeah, I think that probably really opened your eyes to the possibilities of where surfing could take you, maybe.
Well, there wasn't anywhere to go yet. There was nothing. I mean, I remember when was it, 61 or 62, our high school actually screened Bruce Brown's The Endless Summer, which was really a surprise, that they had an assembly and showed us a surf movie. But that was really the first one that really kind of, well, popularized the fact that here were people, surfers, traveling to, crazy parts of the world to go surfing. And before that, you just, surfed at your local breaks, and that was it.
Were you sailing as a kid? Did you I know your dad was into throw net fishing a bit.
Yeah, kind of one of my activities was sailboats, even before I really got into surfing. And in a way, that led me to my first surfboard. There was a kid, I was sailing around the harbor there at Alawai, and this kid had come with his parents. They sailed over from Newport, and he had a surfboard on the boat that was his, and he saw my little sailboat, and he goes, "Hey, can I try that sailboat?" And I go, "Do you know how to sail?" He goes, "I just sailed across from California." I go, "Okay." I go, "What about that surfboard? How about you use my boat, I use your board?" And he goes, "Okay." And then I don't know, a couple of weeks later, they were leaving for Tahiti or something, and he goes, he thanked me for all the sailing he got to do in the harbor, because that was kind of fun, just sail around, look at all the boats, and it was always pretty safe there. And he goes, "I'm not much of a surfer, so if you want to buy this surfboard, I'd sell it to you." And it was, I don't know what it costs. I can't remember, but I think it was only like $15 or something, and I didn't have that kind of money, but my dad did, and I asked him, and he went, "Well, you mowed the lawn enough, and if you continue mowing the lawn, I'll buy it for you." So that was my first surfboard, and that was the beginning of it all. That's a big step for a surfer. You go surfing the first time and you have a blast, but the first real big step in a surfing career is when you own your own surfboard. That's really opens up a whole new world.
That's so cool. So did that first board, I'm sure that had a big impression on you. Did that kind of influence kind of skill and craft going forward on maybe wanting to shape your second board?
Well, it actually did, because, I didn't realize that it was such a great board. It was a Joe Quigg, and I had at that time no idea who Joe Quigg was. Later on when I found out and the board was already gone, I went, what an idiot that I got rid of that board, because Joe Quigg was one of the real pioneers that really brought surfboard design and shape into the modern era. And, he had quite a history. We became very good friends. But this board, the kid had dinged the nose really badly and never repaired it. And so that was the first thing I did with this board. I knew I had to fix it. And, the whole process of that ding repair was really what kind of set me up to making eventually, years down the line, my own first surfboard, because ding repair is like a small version of building a surfboard. And, afterwards, once I was a surfboard builder, a lot of times I'd get a ding in my surfboard like that ding in that first surfboard, and I'd go, It's way easier just to make a new board than fix that thing.
Oh man. So at that time, I mean, there were so many guys coming over from California for the war and kind of staying for surfing, and that combined with everyone in Hawaii already, the whole bigger community of surfing and the cultural influence. Any parts of Hawaii culture, any of that really stick with you?
Well, I mean, Hawaii was our world. And, I mean, I went to Kauai a few times because my mom's family was from there, but that was the extent of me going outside of Hawaii. And it wasn't until I went to my first year in college in Southern California that, I got to see the big world and see how much bigger surfing was there in California than it really was in Hawaii. I mean, surfing was just something we did for fun and recreation, and none of us were looking at it as going any further than the next time we went surfing. And here in California was the pretty much the whole industry. These guys that had started in the mid 50s, going into the 60s when the first surfing boom, when Gidget came out and the Beach Boys music, and things started to take off for these surfboard manufacturers in California, that surfing really started to get popular, and started to almost immediately have this tremendous influence outside of itself. I mean, even if you never surfed, the way the surfers dressed, kind of looked cool, and so that kind of became popular, that people wanted to look like surfers even if they weren't. And that was kind of the beginning of, the very beginning of there being an industry of surfing, because as far as an industry went at that time, all it was the guys that were making surfboards. I mean, there was nobody that was, like today, Quicksilver or Billabong, that were surf companies. There was nothing like that. There was a shorts company called Jansen that made these kind of weird shorts, that didn't really work that good for surfing, but, they thought, well, there's nobody else selling shorts, so they were advertising on the back cover of Surfer magazine, and I remember all of us looking at the shorts and going, well, those will never work. And then there was a couple of like really small, like tailors that sewed shorts, and the really good surfers would, they'd go down to this little Japanese lady that had a little shop right there in Waikiki called Taki's, and they'd get a custom made pair of shorts, and there was another tailor out on the North Shore, H. Miura, and they'd make shorts as well, and for the real true surfers, they'd own a pair of these shorts, None of us could afford a pair of shorts like that, so we just would wear any kind of shorts there were. And, I mean, much later, when like Quicksilver came along, they were really, the first serious company to trade off a good pair of surf trunks. And I mean, look at Quicksilver, how big they became. And it was all because they made good surf trunks. And that was, pretty interesting how this whole industry developed out of pretty much nothing, a bunch of surfers that needed shorts, and, wanted to have a good pair of shorts that didn't rip or fall off when you wiped out, and suddenly, here's this giant industry. And I mean, even like the wetsuit companies, there was the early surfers, and even in the winters in California, nobody made wetsuits for surfing. What they'd wear was, they'd go to the surplus store and they'd buy a surplus wool sweater from the military and wear those, and I go, they kept you warm? They go, kinda. And then, a couple of diving companies, one was called Dive and Surf. These two brothers, the Maestro brothers, ended up starting a wetsuit company called Dive and Surf, and they eventually became, what did they become?
Body Glove, I think.
Body Glove, yeah.
Yeah, those guys.
And, that was the first wetsuits for surfers.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of the industry, and then there was another bunch of surfers that said, I think we can make better wax than the power wax that you bought, that your mom used when she was canning stuff, to make jelly or something. That's what you used to put on your surfboard, and it never went on very well. And so these guys started a surf wax company called Surf Research, and then another guy saw them having some success. The Surf Research was Mike Doyle and Garth Murphy and John Baker, a couple guys down in Encinitas. And then another guy named Zog saw they were having some success, and he came out with another surf wax called Sex Wax. And suddenly these guys had work. They had a business. And, that was kind of the beginning of the surf industry.
Yeah, back then, all of a sudden it was an increase in demand, and you kind of found kind of a creative way to kind of come up with something that was culturally relevant for that, maybe.
Well, I mean, as far as a business thing went, for myself anyway, I just wanted to get a surfboard, and the guy I wanted to get it from, Dick Brewer, was way too busy with all the good surfers, and he didn't have time for me. So my buddy goes, well, let's make our own boards. And I go, well, we don't know how to do that. And he goes, well, you watched them make your last board. I go, I did. And he goes, well, we can do it. And it was his idea. So we got our old longboards, and we stripped the fiberglass off of them, so we had some foam. And he went first, and he had a pair of sawhorses, and it was in his dad's garage, and we made a holy mess. But he shaped his board, then I shaped mine, and then we went down to Fiberglass Hawaii, and the owner there later became a good friend of ours, Ken Culler. He goes, okay, you guys want to glass your surfboards, tell me how long they are, and everything. And so he was really, really helpful, a sweetheart of a guy. He sold us the materials for our first boards, $15 a piece. That's what we paid. And we built our first surfboards, and there were these ugly things. And I remember cutting out a logo or a poster from the Hare Krishna store of the blue Ganesh elephant and glassing that under the thing for my, logo. And then we went down to the beach and tried them, and they worked really good. And I remember paddling in, thinking, wow, that was really great, man. And a friend was standing as I was climbing out of the water there at Ala Moana, and he had money in his hand. He goes, I got $80. I want that board. And I looked at the money, and I looked at the board, and I thought, It only cost me $15. I took the money, and just like that, I was in business. And that was the start of it.
Wow. As a surfer and shaper from the beginning, I mean, you were in business for yourself from an early age. I mean, you kind of saw the demand, so why not? Yeah.
Well, I mean, we were at an age, I mean, I think it was 1968, so I was 19 years old, and, my dad and my mom both were going, when are you going to get a job, And I was going, jeez, and I remember going surfing, and it was just us kids and a bunch of old guys, and all the like top surfers that were like in their 20s, early 30s and stuff. I go, where's all the good guys, And the old guy goes, oh, they got to work. And I go, oh, so they can't come when the surf's good. Not if they don't want to lose their job. And I went, wow. And so I thought about that, and it was really intrigued me. And I went, wow, making surfboards, a pretty good job, because all my friends wanted them, and, I could charge money for them. And I mean, the markup was pretty good. It didn't cost much, for stripping down an old board and getting resin and fiberglass to glass it. And I realized that, wow, if I do this, I got a job, and not like my other friends, who the only job they had, because they wanted to be surfers like me, to be there whenever the waves came, and you didn't have like Surfline back then to tell you when the waves were coming. You had to go down to the beach every day and look, and see if there was waves. A lot of them were selling dope, and I went, that's too scary, man. If you get caught, you're going to go and be in jail, and I don't want to do that. So the surfboard thing actually worked out really good for me, and it worked out even better when, the surf was good. The guys were going, hey, where's my board, man? I already gave you half the money, and I go, yeah, but the waves are good. And eventually they all, knew if the waves were good, they were going to have to wait a little longer for their board. So it kind of became okay to be like that. And, it was the greatest job in the world because I could go surfing whenever I wanted to.
Did you look for mentors in the surf business, or did that come naturally for you?
Well, we started a surf shop, Jack Shipley and I, in 1970 called Lightning Bolt. We had been working for other people before that. And, when you're working for somebody else, you're always kind of a little bit of a slave. And we thought, well, if we had our own shop, we'd be the boss, we'd get to make all the decisions. And so we started this shop, and we started having a little success. I mean, we sold a lot of surfboards. But at one point, this was maybe 1972, been going for a couple of years. And a friend, he was, older than me. He was a generation ahead of me. His name was Dave Rockland. And he had started a surf shop with Dick Metz. This was back in the 60s. The first surf shop in Hawaii, Dick Metz and Hobie Alter started. It was the Hobie shop. And it's right there on Kapiolani Boulevard. And they did really well. But all the other, I found out this later from Dick Metz, who started the thing. Well, he actually worked for Hobie at the time, but, he ran the shop. He said all the other manufacturers, the big manufacturers, Hansen, Gordon and Smith, who else? The South Bay guys, Bing, Jacobs, Yater, all these surfboard manufacturers were seeing the success that Hobie was having in Hawaii with their surf shop, and they were thinking about starting a surf shop of their own. And so Metz and Dave Rockland got together and talked about it and went, let's go talk to all those guys over there. And so they went over there and they kind of had a plan, and they talked to all the manufacturers, and they said, okay, what we'll do is we'll take 10 of your boards, and, we're going to have all these other guys come in, and as soon as we sell a board, you can send us another one. And so those guys went, well, that's easier than starting our own shop over there and having all that, overhead expense and everything. So they went for it. And so Metz ran the Hobie shop, and Rockland ran Surfline Hawaii and, all the surfboards. And right away, he was a very creative, very brilliant guy. He started making swimsuits and girls' bikinis. And, he was having some success doing that. And at one point, they overproduced the bikini tops, and so he had like 100 extra bikini tops and no bottoms. And so he had this idea, so I'm going to send these to the Johnny Carson Tonight Show. And it was really a brilliant idea, because every night, Johnny Carson gets this box of girls' bikini tops in these beautiful floral, Hawaiian print patterns. And every night he'd go, I got this box from this guy in Hawaii. Look at this stuff. And he'd pull it out, and he'd put a top over himself and give one to whoever his guest was, and they'd put them on. They'd go, yes, I don't know, Surfline Hawaii, never heard of it, but look at these things, He did it for like almost 2 weeks, and it was like this, all of a sudden, it was like this huge promotion for Rockland. So his business started taking off. So he moved into the clothing business and, let somebody else run the surf shop. And that was who Shipley and I worked for when we were, before we started Lightning Bolt. So in 1972, he and I were friends, and he was watching what I was, was happening with the surf shop. And he goes, you need to learn a little bit about business. Come and work for me. And I went, okay, well, what am I going to do? He goes, we'll see. And so I started working for him, and he had me do everything in the business, starting like shipping and, just all the stuff in the rag business. And, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was really more of an education in life. And, you asked about early mentors, and he was really the first one. And he introduced me to all the guys in California, Grubby Clark, the Hoffman brothers, everybody, so they all became mentors to me as well. They, I don't know, must have saw something in me that I never noticed before, but, they let me hang around, and I got to really learn a lot about bigger things than I ever was thinking about. And so that was quite an education. And, we became lifelong friends, all of us. It's just sad that now I'm so old, and, there's falling off one by one.
Pretty incredible. Be around the gang and the crew that you were with at the time, and still stay friends with everybody through business and surfing, and I'm sure there was some really lessons that were applied to everything.
Yeah, because they were really the guys that started the industry of surfing. And so it was really not only wonderful friendships, but just a wonderful opportunity to learn the history and see where it all came from, which, when you're a young, dumb surfer, you never think about that stuff until somebody smarter than you points it out and goes, this is how it used to be.
As surfers, you guys just wanted to get in the water, and if you can make a buck at the same time, man, shoots. What's do you have like one lesson you could share with would-be surfers or backyard shapers?
Well, it's been said that you end up hopefully doing what you do best. And I think if it's something that you enjoy doing, why not do it? I mean, if you can make it a business and, make some kind of living off of it, then, I mean, it's better than working for somebody else doing stuff that you don't like. And I think that, especially in this industry that we're in, there's always these opportunities to do stuff like that, to do stuff that you really enjoy doing. And you got to love it. And if you don't, find something else that you do.
There's inspiration in that. Obviously, you did kind of the business side, and then I'm sure at some point you were like, man, I need to get in the water. And obviously, you were in town and in Honolulu, and I don't know how much time you were spending out on the North Shore, but I'm sure at some point it was kind of town or North Shore, and you kind of picked pipeline, obviously.
Well, I mean, the whole business thing kind of established itself pretty early on that, building surfboards was a great way to be able to go surfing when the waves were good. And, like I said, you never knew when that was back then. I mean, if you were ambitious, you could go down to the National Weather Service at the airport, under the control tower, and they had satellite maps back then, but we didn't know how to read them. We didn't know where surf came from. But I just wanted to go surfing, and, town was great surf in the summertime, and then the North Shore was, we used to call it the country back then, was great surf in the wintertime, so they kind of balanced each other out. And that was just kind of what we did, and the main surf break back then was Sunset Beach. That's where all the best surfers were, the best surfing happened. Sunset, the reason Sunset was like that was because it took such a wide variety of swell direction, and even the strong trade winds, it was still a great wave. And the pipeline in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s, was not a real popular spot. And the main reason for that was because of the surfboards. They weren't really designed for a wave like that was so fast and so steep and so quick. And, I liked that place because, well, it was a left, and there weren't that many people there. And so I started surfing there a lot, and the thing about the pipeline is that surfboards never lasted long there. That wave broke more surfboards. I mean, here's a funny story. One time, Laird and Buzzy Kerbox were staying at the pipeline house, and they got up and looked at it, and there was already like, super crowded lineup. So they just sat there. They go, okay, we're going to count how many surfboards break today, because it was, good solid 8 to 10 foot swell at the pipeline. And they sat there, and at 11 o'clock they gave up. I go, how many? They go, over 50. We couldn't see all of them. I went, holy cow. But I remember that, and back then I would only have one surfboard. Most surfers did. The idea of a quiver wasn't really happening yet. And so if your board broke in half, and it did quite often for me at the pipeline, I'd have to go and make another one. And each time I made one, I'm being a shaper, I'm trying to design it to ride better and, be a good board for the pipeline. And finally, at one point, I was able to do that. And I built a board. It was an 8-foot pintail. I called the Coral Cruiser. Actually, it was my brother Victor that named it that, because when I went to glass it, I thought I was glassing it yellow, but I must have got some brown in there, because it came out kind of looking like baby shit. And in a generous vein, Victor called it, well, we'll call it the Coral Cruiser. And it was a board that was just, head and shoulders above any other board that I had. And not only for myself, but everyone else that rode it realized that, wow, this board really works good in the big, not only the pipeline, but Sunset or Haleiwa, it works good in a big country wave. And I had a lot of success with that board at the pipeline. And, after we started the Lightning Bolt, then I started building more and more boards like that. And that board, for some reason, stayed in one piece for 3 or 4 years somehow. Wow. And, a lot of people rode it. And then I never knew what happened to it, and it wasn't until, it's only about maybe 15 years ago, a good friend of mine, Rob Burns, who at one point had come to me and goes, I want a job. I know how to shape surfboards. I go, okay, show me your board, and he showed it to me, and he was a good shaper. And I go, okay, I'll hire you. And so he shaped for us at Lightning Bolt. And, later on after Lightning Bolt, he went on to start a much bigger company called Local Motion. And he had a lot of success with. But finally he copped to, he had the Coral Cruiser and he broke it in half. And he didn't want to tell me that he broke it in half. So he broke it up into little bits and stuffed it in the dumpster. And that was the fate of the Coral Cruiser. And for years he would never tell me. And, we were tight and he would never tell me that. But, that was the beginning of, because the pipeline was so much more easy to photograph, Sunset was way the heck out in the ocean. And, you needed a giant lens, and even then, all the mist and everything, it was never real clear, where the pipeline broke pretty close to shore. And so anytime it was good, the photographers would come and, especially in the very early days, any pipeline footage in the surf movies, which was another big part of the surf culture back then, was generally featured in the wipeout section. And it wasn't really till, some of us started having some success there that the photographers started coming more and more, even on the days that weren't exceptional, just hoping to get that tube ride, shot that was kind of a new thing in surfing. And, because I had this board that worked better than anybody else's, it was me who got a lot of those tube rides. And McGillivray and Freeman made a movie called Five Summer Stories, and they, featured me getting tubed in that movie, and it opened a lot of doors for me. And I think the downside of it was, a lot of guys saw that surfing was kind of cool and became surfers and came to the North Shore, and surfing grew into this huge sport where all the surf spots got really crowded, and a lot of my friends just went, "This is too much," and quit surfing.
Yeah, I'm sure that was at a time where, there was Makaha, there was Haleiwa, Sunset, Waimea, a lot of big wave surfers. And at the time, this is probably going back, but Walter and Flippy Hoffman and Mickey Munoz, they were also kind of big wave surfers. Did you get any influence from those guys? Or
Well, they were the pioneers. They were the first ones. The Hoffman brothers, the first big surf that really was, being surfed in Hawaii was Makaha Point. And the Hoffmans were big out there, them, Buzzy Trent, George Downing, of course, Wally Forsyth, Woody Brown. Those guys were the early guys. And then they started to surf the North Shore, and at first the only wave that really compared to Makaha Point, which was, a place that rarely broke because you needed a strong north swell, was Laniakea, and that was the one that they liked when it was big. And Sunset, I remember, Buzzy going, "It's just a takeoff, it's no big deal." And they liked Waimea because it was the biggest wave. And, like I said, back then, the pipeline wasn't that popular. But, as the surf movies started to popularize or make it popular, those guys, they all still went to the surf movies. So, that's why I got to be so friendly with them, because they saw me and, they had all tried to surf the pipeline, and, probably more just their equipment wasn't great and they didn't put in as many hours as I put in, but they liked that, and so that was one of the things that we could share together, and they would tell me stories about, the stuff that they got to do. Mickey, with Greg Knoll and a bunch of other guys were the first guys to ever go paddle out at Waimea and surf that, and make that become a popular spot. And, so it was great, those good old stories. And
yeah,
it was the beginning of it all.
That was it, kind of, right?
Yeah.
And he kind of mentioned to me about I don't know if this first surf contest that happened at Pipe was a contest or it was an expression session.
Well, yeah, Jeff Hackman coined the term expression session, and he was sponsored by a company called Golden Breed that was kind of a sub brand of Hang 10.
Okay.
And, Duke Boyd had started Hang 10, and they had this idea because this was in the, I guess, 1970. Contests were kind of, it was like we were all hippies, and everybody was, "Hey, man, that's like confrontational, man. We don't want contests." And so they came up with this idea for that Jeff called the expression session, where they would pay 24 invited surfers $200 each to surf for 2 days, and they wanted to have it at the pipeline because by then they saw the kind of the promotional value that Pipeline held. And,
I'm
you
sure.
know, you put all the good surfers out there, and if the waves are good. But the first year they had it was 1970, and the waves were never good. And so they went over and, you know, they tried to have it in Maui, and it didn't really go. But the next year, 1971, there was a day where the Pipeline was kind of going off. It was kind of a stormy, cloudy day, a little rainy, you know, but the waves were good and they were big. It was, you know, solid 10 feet with, you know, second reef sets. And, you know, here were 24 guys that a lot of them hardly ever surfed the Pipeline, like Barry Kanaiapuni, you know, and Eddie Aikau. You know, they never really came out there that much, but they went out there and ripped, you know, and all the guys ripped, but I had the Coral Cruiser. And so, you know, I happened to be the guy that got a bunch of tube rides and, you know, came out. And so that was kind of a cool deal. But the next day was a Saturday. The sun came out and it was beautiful and the surf had tamed down and it was really a nice day. And I remember, you know, waking up and looking at the Pipeline going, oh man, this is the day. This is the day we should have had it. And then they decided, well, we had it at Pipeline yesterday. Let's go have it at Sunset. And I went, you guys go to Sunset. I don't care about that $100. I'm going to surf the Pipeline. And that was the day that Greg and Jim, you know, McGillivray and Freeman, they had a special camera, a super slow motion camera that they were going to run. And they go, are you going to Sunset? And I go, no, I'm going to surf here. Look how good it is. And he goes, okay, good. We'll stay here and we'll film you. And, you know, it ended up super slow motion. That was the final sequence of their 5 Summer Stories movie. So, and I had no idea, you know, I mean, back then, you know, sometimes you worked with a photographer, but not that often, you know. I mean, he'd go out surfing and they'd be on the beach and they'd film and you'd just surf, and you didn't know until the surf movie came out if, you know, they got any good shots or anything. And when 5 Summer Stories came out, you know, we went to the theater because it was the first surf movie that they actually showed in a movie theater. And it was the Kaimaki Theater, you know, theater that I grew up going to movies at. And we went there and all of us just, whoa. And I remember, you know, they go, wow, that's you. And, you know, afterwards I walked out and I was like in a daze and went, holy cow.
That must have been cool.
That was, you know, that was 1972. So that was kind of the beginning of, you know, the whole thing for me.
That connection with Pipeline that really for you was kind of it at that time. Did that, I mean, you've always kind of had a deeper sense of spirituality, but it probably maybe kind of came from that wave or kind of that time where you were like, this is it for me.
Well, I mean, I got a good picture right there on the wall of the Pipeline, and I can show you a face in that wave that, you know, you look at it and you go, oh, that guy's Hawaiian, you know. But I think for every surfer, going back to and I think pretty much everyone remembers that very first wave they had and remembers that feeling, you know. And I mean, if you try to articulate it, well, what was it, you know, that was made such an impression? And, you know, was it the glide or, you know, it was something that touched you down deep. And, you know, I mean, I've been doing this surfing thing for a long time, and that was a one-hand clapping question, you know, that I thought about for, you know, all these years. And I really believe that surfing has the ability to touch a person pretty down deep in their soul, and make an impression there that maybe is difficult to understand, and certainly difficult to articulate about, but it's something that happens and it's real. And I think it's a religious moment. It's a very spiritual thing. And so over the years, I've felt that surfing is a very spiritual endeavor, and if that's how you choose to see it and embrace it, and I do, and I think it's a great thing, and I think that for every surfer, that spirituality is there, whether they recognize it or not, and it's okay if they don't.
Yeah, completely. What's the value of quiet for you? It seems like you've gone seeking solitude, escaping from the crowds through your life. Why?
Well, I guess that comes down to how I ended up here in Bend, Oregon, not even realizing why I'm here, but until much later. At first it was just like snowboarding, got hooked on snowboarding, and it was actually Derek Ho and Sonny Garcia who told me that the snow in the mountain here was really good at Mount Bachelor. They had been here a bunch of years already. So we came, and that was, we were here 3 days on that first winter trip, and we ended up buying a house. We were here with Grubby Clark and his wife, and, the girls found a house for sale, and Grubby said, let's buy it quick before they find something more expensive. But I didn't realize it at the time that it was the beginning of something that I really needed in life. Here my life before that had been this life in the ocean, chasing waves amid this chaos and movement and, ocean, just always in motion. And what I found in the mountains was not only quiet, but was the stillness that I didn't realize that I needed in my life to help balance it. In Chinese philosophy, yin and yang is used to describe how seemingly contrary or opposing forces in the natural world are actually interrelated and even interdependent. And, they say that health and harmony is created when yin and yang are in balance, but that balance is never static. It's, the constant rebalancing, continual, trying to balance itself. So that balance is always in motion, and the center is the middle is what they call the Tao, and that's the tranquility that's found at the center of all events. And it's when you move away from the center that you take on aspects of yin or yang, and here I didn't know if it was yin or yang, but I had this life that was, all about the ocean. And then coming here to the mountains, I found that quiet and that stillness that needed to balance me and get me back to the Tao.
Yeah.
And I still love it here, as much as this area has grown and the mountain has become busy. you still find that stillness up there, and you know that. I mean, you spent a lifetime in that stillness, and I mean, there's at times can be some radical movement, but generally speaking, it's the mountains are a quiet place.
There's something about it, that time in nature spent with your friends and your loved ones out there. It's pretty special.
Yeah.
So Tony, your wife kind of got you into snowboarding at first, yeah?
My
Tell it.
wife has got me into all the good things in life.
She's the best. Tell us about your first day, first days on snow.
Well, it was her idea. We were, at her folks' house down in Redding. Alex was just born, and we came over for Christmas to show him Alex, and their first, I mean, her mom was there for the birth, but, show her dad and, all the grandma and grandpa and everybody, the first grandchild, and we came, and Mount Shasta was right there. And so all of a sudden she has this idea, just out of the blue, like she always does. She goes, let's try snowboarding. And I went, what? I don't know. It's cold. But she had kind of already, she hadn't told me, but she had thought ahead, because she had gone down our old Lightning Bolt Maui store when I had sold out. A friend of mine bought it, and he was the first Patagonia dealer on Maui. So Tony had gone down and bought me this cool Patagonia jacket that was, I mean, it was too much for Hawaii, but it was a nice warm jacket, So I had a nice jacket, and she had borrowed this jacket from a girlfriend that was a sponsored windsurfer, and it was a Neil Pride jacket, it was nice and bright. And Shasta didn't have any snow, and we found that out because we went to this shop to rent some boards and stuff, and they actually had pretty good boards. I ended up with a Burton, I can't remember what it was called, but I remember looking back at the picture of it and showing it to JG, and he goes, oh yeah, that was one of the first good boards we had, And
Yeah, maybe a Burton Air or something cool like that.
I think it was way before the Airs. It was, yeah. It was, early Burton. I mean, but, and I'm the whole time I'm like rolling my eyes going, oh, geez, another one of my wife's harebrained schemes. But they told us that, yeah, Shasta doesn't have any snow.
Okay.
And, it's not even open. So you can go drive up to Ashland, which isn't that much further, and they got snow. And so we went up there, which was here in Oregon, and, we didn't know anything. Signed up for a lesson, but had to wait like it was in a couple hours. So watching these guys come down, the bunny slope, that was the only place that anybody really was riding, and we walk up to the lift and got our snowboards, like surfboards, under our arms. The guy goes, where are you going? We want to go up there. He goes, well, you got to put those boards on your feet. Oh, we look around, everybody's got their boards on. Oh, okay. So we went up there, and right away we went, wow, this is kind of cool. We didn't know how to do it. It felt like riding on a surfboard with no fins, it kept sliding out. We didn't know how to use the edges or anything. And then we took a lesson, and we had a good time, and we were kind of jazzed. And so, we're driving home, and she goes, well, did you like that? I go, yeah, let's go again tomorrow. So we drove back to Redding, and she goes, geez, okay. So I go, let's go back to the shop because we got to tell them we want to use the stuff again. And I went, and I was trying to, I go, you guys got any literature or anything about how to snowboard? And, they had some magazines and stuff. I bought everything I could. And then the next day we went back, and, we're kind of the bunny slope is very bunny-like. And so I'm looking at the other side of the hill, and there's this other slope that goes way up, and I go, let's go over there. And she knew a little, because she skied a little, she knew a little more than I did. She goes, I don't know, that's a black diamond slope, and I go, so? It's just like this one, but it's longer. It was all moguls, and she's shaking her head. She should have put her foot down. But we get up to the top, and there's nobody on it, and it's just like a total mogul feeling. It's solid ice, So we ended up going down on our butts, and she had that jacket from her friend. It left this yellow streak all the way down the hill. And we got down to the bottom, you see you and your big ideas. But that was it. That hooked us on snowboarding, and that was the beginning. And, they ended up coming here. That was, how it started, and how, in the end, what I realized, what it meant to me, and, what it did for me was, I guess, how things are when, you really let them, that they're kind of meant to be.
Yeah, I feel, there's guidance in that, in how experiences can teach you, right?
Well, I mean, if you're the smartest guy in the room, you're in the wrong place. But, you always want to be learning, and whatever it is, I mean, you really want to be learning about yourself too, and if you have an open mind, you do learn a lot.
Yeah, I always say that how cool it is that we have kind of friends throughout different sports, and having that open mind, and most of the time we always say yes to trying new things, and that could lead any way, any direction. Could end up with a broken bone, or it could lead to really great stories. And it's usually you say yes, and probably an afterthought is after it happened, you're like, shit, why did I say yes? That was crazy.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's just the way I am, but it was the way Tony was too. We always, like, we met during the windsurfing. We were both learning how to windsurf together, and we ended up loving that. I mean, really getting obsessed with it. And, I mean, there was a point in my life where I wouldn't even put the surfboard in the truck. When I drive down the hill to go to the beach, I just go windsurfing. And then, eventually the surfboard came back in, and finally, the windsurfing gear stayed in the garage. But, it was, I was obsessive about it. And the same thing with snowboarding, and it's kind of been like that for me all the way through. I see something that looks really cool, and I want to try it, and just, drop everything else and just get into that. And
yeah, whether some of the friends were into motorcycles or going into the mountains to go snowboarding or business, there was kind of beauty in failure, and kind of trying something new, and failing, and kind of, all right, I'm going to try this, or, I'm going to learn from that.
Well, yeah. And then, in the end, the greatest lesson is the one to, that it's okay to be a kook. And sometimes in life you got to embrace being a kook.
I don't think I ever tried river surfing until I came to Bend. Maybe I did a little bit out in Utah, but not much, I think it was such a commitment for me with snowboarding that was kind of it. But all of a sudden, river surfing was a thing out here in Bend, and you guys were kind of on it early on. And we talked a little bit about how, it's a totally different thing than surfing, and and it really humbles you. I was out there, we had a couple sessions together, and I hadn't done it in a little while, and it was super humbling and back to being a kook, but it was such a fun opportunity to kind of, back to the beginning and learn how to do it, right?
Well, I never did it either before I came to Bend, but it is, when you let yourself be a kook, it's actually kind of fun. You can get a giggle out of it, And,
So true.
I mean, the whole river surfing thing here was a friend of mine who was actually, uber athlete, Olympic team Nordic skier, and a, expert kayaker. And told me, he goes, I think there's this wave out here that we can ride a surfboard on. And I went, really? All right, well, let's go look. It was a nice, hot summer day. We drove out north of town here, drove through this subdivision, got on this dusty dirt road, drove down it, and then he pulls up next to this kind of a bank there and turns off the car, and I hear water running, so I walk up the bank, and right there, I mean, I could pee on this wave, was this beautiful, perfect little glassy peak, and I went, wow, that's kind of cool. And he had this beat up old, like kind of mid-length style board, it was an old Becker, and I mean, it was all beat yellow and everything. And so he got down in the river and, jumped in and stood up, and he had, surfing wasn't his thing. He had gone a few times, but he was very, very athletic, And so he's standing up, and he's standing, I mean, from me to you away, and he's riding this wave, and I'm standing on the bank watching him going, that is cool. And, eventually he fell off, and I go, let me try that thing. And, I got in, stood up and went, wow, here's this water coming downstream at us, and it makes this little thing that looks like a wave, and you get up on it, and you're standing on it on a surfboard, and it feels like you're going really fast, but you're not going anywhere. You're just staying right here. And I went, thinking, okay, what surfboards do I have in my garage that might be better than this thing? And, the next day we came out there, and I brought my littlest boards, and, that was the beginning of it. And I think we were the first ones to ride a surfboard in it. And, the word got out. These high school kids started coming, and we told them, hey guys, you got to keep this double top secret. Otherwise it's just going to get crazy, And they, tried to, but, eventually, I don't know, it just became super popular where there was a big line of guys waiting, and it was, really, really fun. I mean, I took Dan Malloy one time. He came out. He was coming through town, and the surfers, it was the first time I realized that surfers, because it looks like a wave, they try to ride it like an ocean wave, but they don't understand that it's not that it's a river. And, I could see you struggling a little bit today because, you've probably just come from surfing real waves, and, this thing that looks like a wave, but sure doesn't ride like a wave. And, just over the years, I see that the surfers, unless they have some experience with that kind of wave, really have a hard time, and it's just this perception of it, that throws you off. And I remember, Dan just struggling, going, what am I doing wrong? And, I go, it's not a wave. And, eventually, being the expert surfer that he is, he finally got it, and then he was ripping on it, and was going, wow, this is kind of cool. And he must have told Jack, because Jack Johnson came with Donovan and G-Love to do a concert here. And they call me up and they go, hey, what about that wave? We want to go surf it. I go, oh, okay. And I had a bunch of boards, and Ben Moon actually came out there with us and took a bunch of pictures of them. And, Jack grew up on the North Shore. So, he was one of the first guys to dig out the river there at Waimea and ride that standing wave. So he knew how to do it. He was ripping right off the bat, and this wave was like super friendly, unlike the one that we tried to surf earlier. That one's a little on the violent side, a little too yang. But yeah, we had a blast, and then the next day he just goes, because they were there a couple days early, I want to bring the whole gang, and I go, okay. So, they brought Donovan and G-Love and all three bands, because they were all surfers. And they all came out and we had a blast, and I'm looking at the watch going, hey, you guys got a gig tonight, and they're going, yeah, but just one more wave. And finally they go, okay, we better go. And we go back to the amphitheater there, and, everybody's there going, where you guys been, man? We're like, sound check started half an hour ago. You guys, nobody's here. And so, they go, we were surfing. And yeah, so the river surfing thing has become bigger and bigger, especially as the ocean surfers and the surf spots become more and more crowded. This is like really fun. Everybody takes turns and everybody has a good time.
Yeah, there's still that sense of surfing community here, where it's a special thing that we could all do together, and man,
and we
crazy.
Do. There's a lot of togetherness at that wave.
It's wild where surfing can take you. Yeah, I think some of the coolest aspects of surfing is the travel it inspires, right?
Yeah,
I know kind of you traveled quite a bit. One of the first guys to go to different spots. Was there I know you spent a lot of time in Indo, but was there any other places that kind of inspired you? And
well, I think I mentioned that our high school showed 5 summer stories back in the early 60s. I'm not 5 summer stories. The high school showed
the Endless Summer.
The Endless Summer that Bruce Brown had made, and that was really the first surf film about traveling to go to find waves, and that kind of inspired pretty much the world of surfing to go look for waves, instead of just all the regular places where everybody else surfed. Find some place on your own. And, of course, the first places we went were looking for waves in California and, down in Baja and stuff like that. But really the first surf trip that really made an impression on me was going to Australia in 1970. Like I was saying, being a surfer was like not really socially acceptable in America. Surfers were kind of, people looked down their noses at surfers. But when we went to Australia, surfing was like, baseball is over here, or it was kind of a big deal. And the top surfers were really kind of recognized as national athletes. And we were just going, holy cow. And because, we were surfers, we fitted into that category. And wow, oh, we're somebody here. And, you know, today, pretty much everybody in Australia knows about surfing. You know, here in America, a little bit, but not so much. And there's really a lot of surfers there. There's really a lot of great surf spots. In 1970, we had gone down for the world titles. And, you know, I was part of the Hawaii team that went down there. And afterwards, a good friend that we went to high school together and surfed quite a bit together all the way, you know, through, Jimmy Blears, hooked up with this really great Australian guy named David Batty Treloar. Batty was his nickname because I guess he was kind of a badass. You know? But he was like us, you know, he was a typical surfer. And we traveled from Sydney all the way up to Noosa and surfed pretty much every surf spot along the way. And back then, you know, it was, most of the spots were empty or just a couple of guys. And it was one of the most wonderful surf trips I can ever remember. And it was, you know, kept going back to Australia just because I remembered what a wonderful time I had, how great the Australian people were. And it was from Australia that I ended up, a friend of mine who was an American who had gone down with us on that 1970 trip, guy I grew up with, Jack McCoy. And at the end of the trip, you know, when we were all going home, he goes, "I'm staying." I go, "What do you mean you're staying?" He goes, I want to live here." And I went, wow. So he did, you know, he married an Australian gal. He's lived in Australia. And he, at one point, a couple of years later, he was living in Torquay, you know, in Victoria there. And we went down for the Bells contest or something. And he had this, with a couple of friends, they owned this health food restaurant. And there was this picture on the wall. And I looked at it and I went, wow, that's Wayne Lynch, you know. And Wayne is a great surfer, Australian surfer whom I admired from, you know, the early or the late mid 60s, you know, when he was featured in the early surf movies. And, you know, we had become good friends. And I go, that's Wayne. And the only pictures I'd ever seen of him was, you know, in a full wetsuit. And he was in a pair of board shorts. And I go, I'm looking at the wave going, wow, it's this barreling wave, you know. And I go, where is that? And he goes, that's Bali. That's a place called Uluwatu. And I go, well, we're going, man. And we did. And that was the beginning of that whole Indonesian experience in my life, which was probably one of the most, well, the best surfing adventure that I ever had.
So amazing.
Yeah, it lasted a lot of years too.
Travel like waves as peaks and troughs. Can you tell us about a particular low point in any of your travels?
You know, I don't think there were any real low points. I mean, on one trip with Jack McCoy and another good surfer partner of mine, Roy Mesker, Big Roy, we called him. He was a professional model because we called him Mr. Hollywood because he was so good looking. And I had a relationship with a company called Golden Breed in Australia, and they ran out of a town in South Australia called Adelaide. And so we went down there, and Jack wanted to take us to this surf spot called Cactus. And this was out in the middle of nowhere, So we went to the company and they loaned us the use of they called it a ute, and it was like their Holden version of a Ford Ranchero or a Chevy El Camino.
Okay.
I don't know. It was just like that, a hot rod, but with like a open bed in the back. So we tossed our surfboards in the back. But, Jack and Big Roy are both big guys, and all they had were 2 bucket seats and then the center console. And so, at first, I was, since being the little guy, I sat in the middle, and we started driving, and it was like, I don't know, 300 miles or something. It was a long ways. The road was like dead straight. It just went up and down. And then finally, my butt was like killing me. I go, let me drive for a while. So I don't know if it was Jack or one of the other Big Roy. They got in the middle, and I got in that car, man, and I just floored it. And we were like going, as fast as that car would go, because it was just a dead straight road. I mean, we got air a couple of times on those leaps, but finally we got there, and this was probably the ass end of the universe, man. It was like so hot and miserable, and it was windy, and oh man, we got out there and we're going, oh, what are we doing here? And the surf was okay, but it wasn't great. And I remember afterwards going, Jack, oh man. So that first night, he knew one of the guys that had like this little tin shack that was, maybe 8 by 10 feet. That's how big it was. And the thing was like super hot, And he goes, well, he's got an extra bed. I'm sleeping in here. You guys got to sleep in the back of the ute, okay. And so we had one long air mattress and one short one. And Big Roy grabbed the long one, And so I had the short one. But because he got the long one, I got the thicker blanket. And he had this thin one. And we had no idea because it was like blazing hot. And the sun went down and it started getting cold. Man, it was freezing that night. And then the wind was blowing. And Big Roy had, because, it was so hot and we were all sunburned. He had all this, because he was a model, he had all this cold cream all over his face, to preserve his skin and, maintain his good looks. And we woke up in the morning and I looked over at him and the sand had just coated his face, and, he hadn't shaved in a couple of days. He looked a mess. And that night, when it got really cold, I took the blanket and I went inside the car and, slept in the car, and he froze his butt off that night. And I guess if you had to say there was a low point in one of our travels, that was it.
That's all time. Oh man, Jack makes incredible films, and kind of those early days in Australia must have been a trip. Your time at G-Land and Uluwatu, I mean, what a profound experience being there at that time. Can you tell us a little bit about what those waves taught you? And what about the solitude? What did you learn while being alone there?
Well, G-Land was really something special. It was not only a great wave, but we were pretty isolated out there, and we were kind of on our own. And, Mike Boyum was the one who set up the surf camp, and he was really a kind of visionary in that, and way ahead of his time. He had done a bunch of skiing, and he hadn't been, but he knew all about what Mike Wigley was doing with the heli skiing up in BC.
Okay.
And that was kind of where he got the idea to have this surf camp, and he knew what Wigley was charging up there, and he figured that he could do that as well. He'd charge $100 a day, And he could, there were surfers to come surf that wave, which was tremendously consistent and, really, really a challenging, beautiful, magnificent wave. And it was a good caper, and, he kind of had his own issues that he didn't, if he didn't like you, he wasn't very friendly. And, he ended up kind of losing the concession out there, but he started something that was really special. And I mean, I went there several times a year. Once we started going there for the next, 20-something years in a row. And to me, it was really the zenith of my entire surfing experience. And, because it was Southern Hemi, their season was our soft season, was our summer. And so I'd come back to the North Shore after being in G-Land in like top shape, and everybody else, had been like languishing in the heat of the summertime Hawaii. And, the North Shore would start up and I was ready for it. And, they were struggling to get back in shape. And it was really a very, very special time in my life that, and, oftentimes it was just me and Peter McCabe out there. And so we had this act that we did, where we were able to both surf the same wave at top speed and never once get in each other's way, just in total synchronization, absolute harmony, and just both going full speed, just riding this wave, as if we were the only ones on it, but riding it together, which was really, really special. And, it was just the whole experience of it, because, like I said, there's, just the few people that were in the camp, they were the only people that were there. And all the wild animals that were there, there was actually 2 Sumatran tigers that lived in the jungle there and, were protected by the jungle rangers. But at one point, one of them came into the camp, and it was at a time when, because what we do is the way Boyum figured it, the best time to be there was during the new moon or the full moon, where you had the big tide swings. And that way you could, when the higher tide came in, you could paddle from the beach all the way out to the surf and, have a good 3 or 4 hours of surfing and still be able to paddle all the way in. In between the new and full moons, there was, the median tides where it didn't get so high or didn't get so low. And we'd usually go back to Bali, go to the nightclubs or, do stupid stuff. And I remember one point, the trip was over, and I go, Mike, I think I'm going to stay. You guys go back. And he goes, all right. Because there was always a camp boy there. Because if there wasn't somebody there, the monkeys would come in and just ransack the place. And so I stayed, and, he would cook. And he only knew how to cook for, 10 or 12 people. So every night he'd make all this food. He didn't know how to make smaller portions, and there was not enough refrigeration to keep the leftovers. So, one morning I saw him and he was like totally freaked out. And I went, wow, what's up? And then he was trying to tell me, and, my Bahasa was insufficient to understand exactly what he was trying to say. So he ran to the garbage dump and he got a can, an empty beer can of Tiger beer, and he pointed to the tiger. And, then I went, wow. Tiger. And then he kind of did this pantomime of, what he was doing. He was washing the dishes in the morning right there at the water's edge. He was in the sand. And he sent something, and he looked up, and then he became the tiger. And this tiger, just majestic, regal, looking at him with total disdain, And I was seeing it because he was doing this pantomime, and then he became him again, freaking out, and he backed into the water, and then he became the tiger again. The tiger just, looked at him, walked over, and jumped up. And it was, a good 10-foot jump from the sand onto the rocks above. And then, I asked him, show me where. And we went down, and there was the pug mark from that tiger as he pushed off to jump up. It was as big as a plate,
Holy shit.
And I went, holy cow. Yeah, that afternoon, Peter McCabe and Sparky from Rainbow Sandals and another friend, Rick Sword from Maui, they came in to join me in the camp, because they knew that I was staying out there, and they didn't want to stay in Kuta either, so they came out, and we went out surfing, and it wasn't that great. And Sparky, he had a short leash, and he kind of got the back of the board in the back of his head, and it split open his scalp. And, so we went in that night, and I had a really sharp Swiss Army knife, so I shaved all the hair away, and I didn't have any suturing gear, which afterwards we always brought with us. But I butterflied the cut together, but it was, a pretty good-sized wound, and it was kind of oozing, the back of your neck's really thick skin there. And so we had dinner, and then we're all up in the treehouse, and all of a sudden, just like in the jungle, we hear this really loud meowing. You know how when a cat's in heat, but like super, super loud. And I'm just going, holy cow, I forgot, and everything that happened to tell these guys about the tiger. And I guarantee you that's the tiger out there. And I tell them, they're going, oh, geez. And I go, hey, Sparky, why don't you go sleep down in the mess hall? And he's looking at me, he's going, I'm not going down there. And I look down, and I go, oh, that tiger could easily jump right up here if he wanted to. And so all night long, which was kind of a good thing because, with Sparky with a head injury, we kind of wanted to make sure he didn't pass out.
Got to check on him, yeah.
And so we're up all night, and the cat all night long was just out there, man. It was crazy.
I know you were doing a lot of yoga out there, but beyond books about yoga, were you reading or listening to music during your travels? Or was there anything that really influenced you as a traveling surfer?
We did. There was a lot of time for reading, and just whatever we had to read, and the music thing was in Bali. You could get back then. It was 8-track tapes or little cassette tapes.
Yeah, you had a Walkman, I think, or something.
And then finally, Walkmans and stuff like that. And you could always get bootleg music. That was the first place, here, or even in Australia, you had to pay to get music. There you could get the same music, but like for pennies, So we had a lot of music.
There's this idea of the beginner's mind in Buddhism. A beginner's mind is a Zen Buddhist philosophy that encourages people to approach new situations with an open mind and without preconception. Do you have an idea of what a beginner's mind has taught you?
Well, I think that's been my whole life, because
Yeah.
I've always found myself becoming interested in, things like windsurfing and snowboarding and, stand-up paddling and then kite surfing and, wing foiling and surf foiling and all these things that to learn them, you have to be in that beginner state of mind. And, like the surf foiling thing, when I started down there, everybody said, well, the few guys that were doing it said, yeah, it's, if you got a boat or a jet ski or something that can tow you around, learn how to ride that foil. I didn't have any of that. So I went out and, just learned the hard way. Paddled in, tried to stand up, fell off a million times. Two friends watching very carefully looked at me and went, we're never going to try that. Ever. But, either you let those things that are really difficult to learn to do defeat you, or you're motivated to want to learn them. And if you stay motivated, eventually you learn something. Probably the greatest lesson is what you learn about yourself. I think we talked about this earlier about, it's okay. You have to learn the freedom to fail, to be a failure in order to learn how to do something. Because if you, let failure defeat you and quit, then you never learn it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say surrender fits into this idea, right?
And that was, you have to give in to full acceptance and no resistance to being a kook, And I learned that lesson from, when we were talking about mentors, from Dave Rockland, where, Dave got me into riding dirt bikes, and we'd be down in these valleys, and to get out of them, you had this slippery, muddy, ugly uphill that you had to get this motorcycle out of because the sun was going down. And, I'd get so frustrated with myself. And he was so calm, even though he was struggling too. He'd go, Gerry, you have to give yourself the freedom to fail. And at first it didn't make any sense, and eventually it did, and it's really one of the greatest lessons for all of us in life. Yeah. That if you hope to get ahead in whatever it is you're trying to get ahead in, and it's something that you have to learn how to do, especially if it's something physical, but especially, and even more so, something mental, that it's okay to be a kook.
Gerry, do you have any snowboarding stories for us? I know you spent a little time with Craig Kelly a little bit once you got more into it, or some trips over to Europe working with sponsors, but...
Yeah, two of Craig's really close friends that we all got to snowboard with. I'm having one of those senior moments where you trying to tell a story, but you can't quite remember the names.
Oh, Friends or Craig, so maybe.
Yeah, no, it was down Swarty.
Okay, down
And
Swords. In Ken Achenbach or
and Ken,
yeah.
Achenbach. So we got to go snowboarding with Craig and Swarty and Achenbach, and they were really great guys and great snowboarders. I mean, they were really the pioneers of the whole thing, and we were very fortunate we got to go to Wiggly's a few times, and go heli skiing in some really beautiful terrain and everything. And at one point, Swarty and all of them, we invited them to come on a surf trip to Tavarua with us, and Craig was a very good surfer. He,
He got it.
knew what he was doing on a surfboard. But Swarty and Ak, I mean, the first day we got there and they took off their shirts, they were so white that, like, we couldn't even look at them, And I think Laird was on the trip and Derek Dorner. And, we told them, okay, you guys, because they hadn't surfed at all, you guys practice in here and the inside, and ride these little waves. And then when we think you're ready, we'll take you out to cloud break, So every day they were hard at it, They weren't getting any, they were only getting red. They weren't getting any tan. But finally there was a real tiny day at cloud break, so okay, you guys are ready. We're taking you out there. Ark's going, well, how big is that? I go, it's tiny. He's going, well, how big is tiny? Because he's sitting in the boat looking at these waves. And Laird goes, 2 to 3 feet, the biggest. So we go out there, and they're flailing around trying to get into these waves. And, finally this set comes, and we're yelling at go, 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 because he's right there and he's in position and he's going and he's just paddling like a windmill and he takes off, and it was actually probably the biggest wave of the day. It was like, 6 feet, He just got pitched over the falls, He comes back out and he goes, oh no, he didn't even come back out. He went straight to the boat and sat in the boat. And so, we come back to the boat and he's going, how big was that wave? And Laird goes, 2 to 3 feet. He goes, no, that was bigger. And he goes, yeah, well, maybe that one was 4 feet. And puts his hands and goes, this is 4 feet. That wave wasn't that big. It was way bigger. We're going, no, it was 4 feet. It was 4 feet. And he's just shaking his head. And so that winter, we all went back up to Wiggly's, and we're coming down, and Ak always had his camera pack with him, and we see this drop ahead, he goes, wait, let me go check this. And he goes, okay, you guys, get going as fast as you can. It's really a good landing. You can all go together. And he's calling me and Laird and Derek, to drop this thing. And Laird goes, well, how big is it? And he goes, oh, it's only 4 feet. Oh, and that's what he said, that day when we were in the boat, when he was going, 4 feet? That wave was way bigger than 4 feet. What do you guys do? Measure the waves from the back? And Laird goes, nobody measures waves from the back, you idiot. And so anyway, he's calling us off this jump, and he goes, yeah, it's only 4 feet. And so we go, okay, and the snow was like super good, So he goes, get all the speed you can. Otherwise, you won't even get off the ground. So we, He goes, okay, when I count down, everybody take off together. Just make sure you got a good interval. Go straight off the jump. So we take off, he says, go. And we take off and we go blasting down the hill. And, we're going pretty good. And we launch off. It's this like 20 plus foot cornice to a total flat landing. We just crashed, eat it, Laird gets up. You asshole, you said that was only 4 feet. He goes, yeah, in Canada we measure from the back.
Oh, good times, man. So cool. Yeah, as snowboarders, we get a lot of influence from surf, whether it's style or board design. And I think we were talking a little bit about kind of that time where big waves were kind of getting really gnarly and the guys were starting to tow surf, and you were hanging with Laird and some of those guys and helping to design those boards for Jaws and Piahi.
Well, I was making all the early tow boards, and we were having a little problem with a lot of the cavitation because all the fins were all glassed on back then.
Because you're going so fast to ride these waves.
Well, yeah, and this was big waves, and we had the same problems in windsurfing because with the sail, you're going faster than you could go on a surfboard. That we never had those kind of problems. And I had talked to this friend of mine that he was a chief designer at Future Fins. His name was Curtis Hasselgrave. Sadly he's not with us anymore, but he was a big windsurfer too. And he was one of the early pioneers in getting true foiling on fins, and that really helped with the cavitation and windsurfers. And, I told him this problems we were having. He goes, put the fin boxes in and I'll foil these fins, that have perfect foils, and it should really help that. And I went, okay. So I built this tow board right here, and I put Future boxes in, but Curtis hadn't made the fins yet, and those guys are going, hey, when are you gonna send that board? And so I sent the board, but all I had was the plastic production fins, and I sent those, and I go, yeah, Curtis said he's gonna make some really good fins, but these ones should be fine. And then I get a call from my phone's ringing. I pick it up, and it's those guys, and they're calling from the lineup at Jaws. They got their cell phone, and they had reception, and they're calling, and they're going, dude, this board, it's just like snowboarding. It's like coming down a big, giant slope of snow. And I went, even with the plastic fins? He goes, oh, man, these work so much better than any of the other boards we've had. And I went, wow, just like snowboarding. And that was the beginning of the whole tow surfing thing really kind of coming together. There was a lot of moving parts there. The whole thing, learning the teamwork and all that. But as the most effective way to ride big, gnarly waves, tow surfing really took the cake.
Yeah.
And that was kind of interesting for those guys who were, at that point in time, two of the best guys doing it, to say that it was like snowboarding was kind of cool.
That's pretty rad. What a time, man. Going forward, you've talked about being in a teacher phase of life. What does that mean to you? Is there a sense of duty to be a guide? And with that, how has the responsibility evolved over the years as an influential surfer? In some ways, you've been a teacher for most of your career to all of us.
Well, it's been said that, you start as a student, and then as you learn, eventually you become a warrior. And then at some point you transition into becoming a teacher. And then hopefully, if you've played your cards right, then you become a priest. And, I think my warrior days are long gone. So I figure probably in the teacher phase of my life. And, especially in surfing, there's no greater joy. I mean, even as much as riding a great wave, the moments that you get when you help someone that's learning or, trying to, or even just struggling with their surfing and can offer something that helps them, and gets them to have some, even if it's a small success, to just something that makes them put a smile on their face. It's really a great thing, and I think that at this point, especially at the river, there's a lot of opportunities just for that, to help people that are struggling.
Yeah.
And to see that smile on their face is very rewarding.
That's really special. What does the word wisdom mean to you?
Wisdom? It's something you hope to acquire in life. Obviously there's some intrinsic wisdom in all of us, and perhaps from past lives, that's held over. But generally, you have to spend most of your life trying to gain some wisdom and learn, and Liam and I were talking earlier today, and we were talking about spirituality and religions, and I was mentioning that, Taoism really made an impression on me. And, now in life, understanding the yin and yang, I can see why, because that's, I believe, always a search for every person to try and find that balance between yin and yang. But Lao Tzu had some really great sayings, kind of like Confucius sayings. And one of them that really struck a chord with me and has kind of stayed with me throughout my career was, it's always easier to ride the horse in the direction it's going. And I think that's kind of been the way of my life.
Noted. What does it mean to be a mentor to your son Alex? How have you approached mentorship as a dad? What has worked for you and Alex? What hasn't?
Well, I mean, I've been a father to him, and I hope that perhaps he would learn something from me, from my mistakes, and not have to go through them. But, everyone has to put their hand on a hot stove to really understand what hot is. And, with him and surfing, well, actually, let's backtrack a little bit. With him and snowboarding, when we came up here, he was very young, and we love snowboarding. We wanted to get him to do it. And at first he was a little resistant. It's too cold. My boots aren't tight enough. I hate these gloves and all this stuff. But we kind of, would drag him up there, and, he'd go take a run with us, a little reluctantly, but then he'd want a bunch of quarters to go play video games in the lodge, and then at one point he saw one of his friends on the chair, and, then other friends started wanting to go snowboarding, and I remember him at one point telling his mother, I'm so glad you made me go snowboarding because, he had already had quite a few runs under his belt, and, he was one of those ones that picked it up pretty quickly. He didn't fight it. He flowed with it, and I got an early picture of him. He already had style, and so snowboarding kind of became his thing, and we enrolled him in all the great mountain programs that they have here. And, the mountain compared to the beach, for a parent wanting to drop their child off and let him go with his friends, is a way safer place, There are a lot of hoodlums at the beach, and, it's a family thing on the mountain. People look after each other up there, and so I think this was really a great place for him, especially him being my son, as opposed to growing up in a beach scene. That there'd be some guy that I dropped in on that was pissed off at me that taken out on Alex, whereas here, nobody knew me as anything but Alex's dad. And that was a great thing, I think even more so for him, to just grow up kind of normally. And then, he embraced snowboarding and got very, very good at it. And, I always wanted him to experience surfing, and because it's brought a lot of joy to me. And, I got another picture of him 8 months old, on the front of my surfboard taking a ride. I remember that. It was on this crappy surfboard that purled, and I lost the board. And I'm holding him up, and as the surge comes, I'm standing on the bottom, and it's over my head, and I'm holding him up, and his mother's freaking out on the beach. And, she's got all the other kids, get that board, get it out there to him right now. And, shouting orders like a general. And, anyway, we used to go out to the coast here with all the other kids, and we got these great pictures of them, all just having fun surfing. But he never really took to it, and a couple of times, like, I took him, and there was a bunch of young punk surfers, loudmouth, and he didn't like that, and I didn't blame him. And, and had the opportunity to take him with a bunch of other friends and their kids down to this left that I thought he'd really like in north of Mazatlan, a place called Cardone, a really great kind of a surf camp type atmosphere. And the first year, the surf was big, and I had him on this little board here that was way too small. And he got, caught inside a few times and got pounded paddling out, and he didn't like it. He wanted to go home, but his mother said, it's only a week, just stay there with your dad. And some of the other guys, were a little smarter than I was, and they got him on a bigger board, and, he had a little more fun. Then the next year, I kind of made him come again, but I built a bigger board, a nice 710 mid-length, and he started, finding his groove, and it was really a good wave, and he was such a natural at snowboarding, so he was kind of digging it a little bit, and we went for like 5 years in a row, and by the end, he was like the first one out and the last one in. And, all my friends, we still talk about this transformation that happened in him, and what a beautiful thing that was, and now, last year he didn't even go snowboarding, the snow wasn't that good anyway, but, and he's building surfboards, he's got a great job, his own, same thing his father did, And, we got to go to Kelly's Wave at one point, and Leah was there with us. She's such a terrific surfer. We had a great time there, and we came in, and I remember telling him, I go, you've been a much better snowboarder than me for a long time, but now officially you're a better surfer too. And as a father, that was really a great thing to be a part of.
That's such a cool thing to say. Yeah, I remember getting to take Alex on a snowboard trip with me to Chile, and made sure we brought our surfboards. And of course, as snowboarders that love to surf or surfers that love to snowboard, we surfed first and had a great time out there. And
that's what he said. Yeah.
Got up to the snow and had a blast also. How do you see mentorship contributing to these cultures like surfing, snowboarding, and craftsmanship? Do you see mentorship as a means to move culture forward?
Well, I think that it's always been like that, probably from the beginning of time. It was called different things, apprenticeship, or, students and gurus, or, whatever. But you always can learn something from someone who's already done it before. And, I think the first thing that surfers and snowboarders realize is they're learning to do it. A great deal of it is by observing, and watching and seeing someone that's better and trying to do what they do, copy them, and that's really all mentoring someone is trying to pass along things that you've learned to try and make it a little less of a struggle for that younger person to, or, maybe the same age person to get it. And, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be anything physical. It's just really that whole concept of learning something, understanding the process of it, of, just embracing the process for the full experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
The being a kook is okay.
I think it's really special. Yeah. I think that's something that we could all learn from and, kind of just think for a sec and be like, wow, we're really lucky to be surrounded by the friends and the family that we have, and to share that stoke with each other and that aloha to keep that going forward. Yeah.
Well, I think we've been very fortunate in this lifetime, to be able to be surfers and snowboarders, and to be able to understand that there's a great deal of learning about life available through these sporting activities that we do, and that really help us when we're not doing them and we're doing the stuff that's really tough in life. The surfing lifestyle when I started surfing was peanut butter and knife sandwiches and living in your car if you had one, and it was like kind of grody. But the yoga lifestyle, the basic 5 tenets of yoga is proper exercise, proper breathing, proper relaxation, proper diet, positive thinking, and meditation. And, that came from yoga, but for me, that was the surfing lifestyle, or what the surfing lifestyle should be, and pretty much became for mostly, at least me and my friends. And pretty interesting that there's those parallels, between surfing and yoga. And at this point in time, I kind of feel that like they're the same thing, that they're actually both a path to some kind of enlightenment, and if you follow the rules, you're going to be better off for it. I mean, at the base level, you want to continue doing the stuff that you like to do, and so you gotta eat right, you gotta think right, and you gotta know how to relax and rest and recuperate, and so that you're able to do it, and yeah, it's all connected.
Yeah. That listening to the body, or listening to the mountain or the ocean, and kind of, I've heard you talk about that in yoga and meditation. It's like we spend a lot of time trying to get to that enlightenment and that place. And surfing or snowboarding, if it's the right moment, you can kind of, jump in the carpool lane and,
pass everyone.
Yeah, that quick way to get there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, you have to, in a sense, be in that meditative state of mind when, you're fully into a hairy drop,
That flow
on
state.
a steep hill, or, even riding a small wave. You can't be distracted, you have to have that kind of Zen state of mind. And we've become so good at going there and being there in those moments when we need them. The trouble is that once you're at the bottom, or at the end of the wave, that moment goes away, and you're just back to regular old you. So I guess the goal is to try and understand how we can stay there even longer, because we can get there instantaneously when we need to. It's just we can't stay there.
Thanks, Gerry.